Dr. James Carter stood at the window of his office and watched the small town of Hillsborough come to life after a long, dreary winter. The streets, recently covered with gray snow, now sparkled under the March sun, and the first snowdrops timidly poked out of the ground along the sidewalks. Spring has arrived, and with it something of an annual ritual began in Hillsborough. People poured out of their houses like ants awakened by the warmth, and everyone seemed to be carrying some kind of secret. James pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and sighed. He felt a strange uneasiness that he couldn't explain. Maybe it's just fatigue, or the spring aggravation that the old ladies at Mrs. Henderson's bakery loved to whisper about. But something told him that it was not just the weather. The doctor's office was on the second floor of an old brick building that locals called the Carter Clinic, although officially it was simply Hillsborough Medical Center. The window looked out onto the main street narrow, paved with paving stones, where small performances of provincial life were played every day. Here is the postman Jack, a lanky guy with an always disheveled bang, again stopped at Mrs. Watson's house. James squinted. Jack had put something in her mailbox, but clearly not a newspaper. He had been fiddling around there for too long. Spring is a time of love, even for postmen, James thought with a slight grin. And old Miss Perkins, who walked her dog named General every morning, told her neighbor that she had seen a ghost near the garbage cans. It was probably Bob with a beer can, James chuckled to himself. He catches ghosts better than sobriety. But this morning's performance could not distract him from his growing sense of anxiety. James ran his hand through his short, already slightly graying hair and returned to the table where a stack of patient files lay. The flow of people has not stopped in recent days. Spring, it seems, has awakened not only flowers, but also all the ailments that Hillsborough residents preferred to remain silent about in winter. Everyone came with their secrets, as he called them. Mrs. Green complained of tired legs, although James knew she was simply too busy dancing at Tony's bar. Young Timmy Crawford insisted that his rash was a cat allergy, although everyone in town knew that he had fallen into nettles a week earlier while running away from an angry farmer Bill. And yesterday Miss Edna, the schoolteacher, came with a request to prescribe something for the nerves. James suspected that her nerves were not from the students, but from the bottle of gin that she hid in her purse. The smell was too obvious. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Being a doctor in a town like Hillsborough was a mixture of medicine, psychology, and detective work. People here did not like to tell the truth, neither about their illnesses nor about their lives. James had gotten used to this after 15 years of practice, but in recent days his patience had begun to crack. Maybe it was because he himself felt out of place. Something was wrong in his own life, but he could not yet grasp the thought by the tail. She slipped away like a fish in troubled waters. James opened his eyes and looked at the photograph on the table. Him and Liz, his wife, with the lake in the background where they had vacationed 5 years ago. Liz smiled, her blonde hair fluttering in the wind, and he stood next to her, slightly hunched over, with a forced smile. Everything was simpler then. Or did he think so? In recent months, their marriage has been like an old car. It seems to be running, but it creaks, it smokes, and you don't know when it will finally stall. Liz began to linger more often at the fitness club, which opened on the outskirts of the city last fall. For health, she said, waving a new sports bag. James nodded, although he didn't understand why she needed so much health at 38 years old. He himself was not a gift. His work took up all his time, and at home he was more often silent than he spoke. But still, something in her behavior, in this new perfume, in laughing too loudly on the phone, made him frown. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. James shook himself, straightened his white robe, and shouted, "Come in." The door creaked, and Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the bakery, entered the office with a basket in her hands. Her round face was flushed, and her gray curls were sticking out from under her scarf. "Good morning, Dr. Carter," she sang, putting the basket on the table. "Here, I brought you some cinnamon rolls. It's spring, we need to refresh ourselves." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," James smiled, although inside he thought, "If I eat just one more, my robe will crack." "What brought you here?" Oh, doctor, she theatrically put her hand to her forehead. My heart is pounding, just like a girl's before a date. Is this normal at my age? James suppressed a chuckle. Mrs. Henderson was over 60, and her dates usually consisted of gossip with her girlfriends over a cup of tea. Let's listen, he said, taking out a stethoscope. Maybe it's just spring that has you so excited. While he checked her pulse, Mrs. Henderson chatted incessantly about how Jack the postman had been frequenting Mrs. Watson, how Bob had gotten drunk again at the bar, and shouted that he had seen a UFO, and how Tom Wilson, the local macho man with ridiculous tattoos, had boasted that he would discover something big. James listened with half an ear, nodding in the right places, but the name Tom Wilson made him wary. Tom was a former auto mechanic who a couple of years ago got rich selling some junk and now considered himself the king of Hillsborough. Liz once mentioned him in a conversation. They say he goes to the same fitness club. Interesting guy, she said then. James didn't think much of it, but now for some reason the name stuck in his head. It's okay, Mrs. Henderson, he finally said, putting away the stethoscope. The heart is like a clock. Maybe drink less coffee. Oh, doctor, you are right as always. She laughed, taking away the empty basket. But in the spring you can't live without coffee, you know. When she left, James went to the window again. The sun rose higher and the street filled with people. He saw Liz walk out of the house across the street with her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She waved to someone, Margaret Jensen, I think, a friend who always wore ridiculous hats with feathers. They started talking about something, laughing, and headed towards the fitness club. James looked at them, and the anxiety in his chest became a little sharper. He didn't yet know what exactly was bothering him. Work, Liz, or this damn town where everyone was hiding something of their own. But he knew one thing for sure. Spring in Hillsborough promised to be hot. And not just because of the weather. 2 days later, James was sitting at his desk, sipping cold coffee from a mug marked Hillsborough's top doctor, a gift from Mrs. Henderson after he had cured her of a heart attack that turned out to be a trivial case of overeating cake. The morning passed slowly, like syrup on a cold plate. He had just sent Tim Crawford home with nettle rash ointment and a prescription for honesty with Farmer Bill when the office door creaked open again. James looked up and nearly choked on his coffee. Margaret Jensen, a friend of his wife Liz, stood in the doorway in full battle dress. She was wearing a huge hat with bright yellow feathers, looking like a sunflower that someone had accidentally dropped into a poultry house. Her dark green coat bulged on her shoulders, and she clutched her purse in her hands as if it were a shield. Margaret always looked as if she was going to a theater performance rather than a remote medical center. James mentally noted, if she thinks this hat protects from the sun, then I'm ready to believe that it cures colds. Good afternoon, Dr. Carter, James, Margaret sang, entering the office with such confidence as if it was her own beauty salon. She plopped down in a chair opposite the table, straightening her hat, which immediately tilted to one side like a drunken sailor. Oh, what's the weather like today, isn't it? Spring is coming right into the soul. Good afternoon, Margaret, James nodded, trying not to stare at her headdress. Glad to see you. How can I help? Margaret hesitated, her fingers nervously fiddling with the strap of her purse. She glanced at the door, as if checking to see if anyone was listening, and then leaned a little closer, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper. You know, I have a problem. Delicate. James put down his mug and folded his hands on the table, preparing for the next portion of the city's secrets. Delicate in Hillsborough could mean anything from a blistered heel to a hangover from Tony's party, but something in Margaret's tone made him wary. He had known her for 10 years, ever since she and her husband, Henry, moved to the town. Henry was an accountant at the local tax office, quiet and boring as an old sofa, while Margaret, on the contrary, loved to be the center of attention. Liz once said that Margaret lives to be noticed. And looking at this hat, James couldn't help but agree with her. Tell me, he said calmly, although inside he was already weighing his options. What worries you? Margaret coughed, straightened the feathers on her hat, and began. Well, for a couple of days now I have been, how can I say, irritated, and the burning, well, there, below, so to speak. In general, it's unpleasant, very unpleasant. At first, I thought it was from the new bath salts, with lavender, but then I realized that no, that's not it. James nodded, maintaining a professional dispassion, even though the light bulb had already gone on in his head. Irritation and burning in delicate places is not bath salts, it's something more serious. He opened his desk drawer, took out the inspection form, and picked up a pen. Where exactly? He asked, trying not to embarrass her more than necessary. Margaret blushed, which was visible even under the layer of her powder. She waved her hand somewhere down, to the area below the waist, and muttered, "There. Well, you understand. Where women are uncomfortable speaking." "I understand," James nodded, making a note. "When did it start?" "Yes, about a week ago, probably," she answered, looking away to the window. "At first, I didn't attach any importance. I thought it would pass. But it doesn't go away, doctor. And I'm a little worried." James narrowed his eyes. A week is no longer an accident. He knew that Margaret was not one of those who ran to the doctor over trifles. She would rather burn cream on herself for a week or drink herbal tea for everything than admit that something is wrong. But then she came, and it meant that the problem was serious. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in his head, and he didn't like the picture. Irritation, burning, a week of symptoms, it smelled like an infection, and not a simple one, but one that is transmitted not through bath salts or from sitting in the cold. "Did you notice anything else? Discharge, odor, temperature?" he asked, trying to sound neutral. Margaret hesitated even more. Her fingers were now almost tearing the strap of her purse, and her hat had completely slipped over her ear. "Well, yes, there was something like that," she finally admitted. "But it's okay, really. I'm sure this is nonsense. Maybe I just overheated in the sauna." James almost choked on air. Sauna? It was the most ridiculous excuse he had heard in months. He remembered Timmy Crawford swearing his rash was from a cat he didn't have, and he chuckled to himself, "Looks like there's a fantasy epidemic starting in Hillsborough." But out loud, he only said, "In the sauna, you say? What brand was this sauna? Maybe I should sign up there too." Margaret giggled, clearly appreciating the joke, but her laughter quickly died down. She realized he wasn't buying it. "Well, in the fitness club," she explained, fiddling with the feathers on her hat. "There's a steam room there. I was there with Liz recently. Maybe the towel was dirty." Liz's name cut through James' ears like a knife through glass. He froze, the pen in his hand trembled, but he quickly pulled himself together. Liz went to that fitness club almost every day. She talked about the sauna, about the new exercise equipment, about the interesting people she meets there. James didn't pay any attention back then, but now Margaret's words sounded like a hint of something more. He pushed this thought away. It was too early to draw conclusions. "Okay," he said, returning to the form. "Let me examine you, and then decide what to do." Margaret nodded, although it was clear that she wanted to fall into the ground along with her hat. James stood up, pointed to the screen in the corner of the office, and added, "Undress from the waist down, I'll be right back." While Margaret reluctantly stomped behind the screen, clothes rustling, James went out into the corridor to get gloves and tools. A swarm of thoughts was spinning in his head. He knew Margaret enough to know that she was not one to easily admit her mistakes. Her sauna sounded like an attempt to hide the truth behind a smokescreen, literally and figuratively. And if his suspicions are correct, then this could be a serious infection that is transmitted through sexual contact. He didn't want to guess yet, but the doctor's intuition suggested that something was fishy. Returning to the office, he found Margaret already on the couch, covered with a sheet. The hat lay nearby, resembling a knocked-down sunflower. James put on gloves and began the examination. Trying not to look her in the eyes, he knew how awkward it was for patients. After a couple of minutes, he finished, took off his gloves, and threw them in the trash. What he saw confirmed his worst fears, clear signs of infection. But he hasn't said anything yet. We had to wait for the tests. "That's it, you can get dressed," he said, returning to the table and making notes. Margaret quickly pulled on her clothes, adjusted her hat, and sat back in her chair. Her face was a mixture of confusion and hope. "Well, doctor, is this serious?" she asked, trying to smile. James put down his pen and looked at her. He could tell right now that the sauna had nothing to do with it, that she needed a pap smear, and that it was most likely something she wouldn't want to tell Henry about. But he decided to remain silent. Not out of pity, but out of professional habit. Facts first, then words. "I don't know yet," he answered calmly. "We need to get tested. I'll write you a direction, and you'll come to the laboratory tomorrow morning." Margaret nodded, but her eyes were darting. Is this necessary? Maybe just some pills? I don't want anyone to know, everyone in Hillsborough gossips." "Definitely," James said firmly. "If it is an infection, it must be treated correctly. And Margaret," he paused, looking into her eyes, "it's better to tell the truth. At least for me. This will help you make a correct diagnosis and prescribe treatment on time or refer you to a specific specialist. But for now, 100% tests." She blushed even more and muttered, "What's the truth, doctor?" "Sauna, I'm telling you." James sighed. He wrote out the directions, handed her a piece of paper, and walked her to the door. When Margaret left, he returned to the table and stared at the empty mug. Sauna, fitness club, Liz. Something about this story was starting to stink, and not just because of Margaret's infection. He didn't yet know what exactly, but he felt. The spring premonition that had been tormenting him since the morning had just received the first hint of a solution, and he didn't like this hint at all. James Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The day dragged on endlessly. After Margaret's visit with her ridiculous sauna, he managed to see 3 more patients. Old John with a cough that turned out to be the result of smoking a pipe on the porch for too long, Miss Edna, who again asked for something for his nerves, and a farm boy who cut his hand on a rusty wire. The usual routine of a small town. But James's head was still reeling from his morning conversation with Margaret. Her hat with feathers, her whisper about irritation, her excuse about the fitness club, all this settled in my memory like dust on an old shelf. He had not yet received the results of her tests, but the doctor's intuition told him this was not just a dirty towel. And mentioning Liz in this context only increased his anxiety. He looked at his watch 4:30. The sun outside the window was already setting towards the horizon, painting Hillsborough in a soft golden light. James stood up to pour himself more coffee when the office door creaked open again. He turned around, expecting to see another patient with a spring exacerbation, but Susan Miller, another friend of Liz, appeared in the doorway. James tensed internally. 2 of his wife's friends in one day? This is no longer a coincidence, but some kind of conspiracy of the universe. Susan was the complete opposite of Margaret. If she resembled an exotic bird with her hats and theatrical gestures, then Susan looked like a typical housewife from a detergent advertisement. A neat bob haircut, a beige sweater, jeans without a single crease. Her husband, Robert, was a school physical education teacher, a strong, silent man who went fishing every weekend with a fishing rod and thermos. Susan held a small purse in her hands, clutching it as if it were a life preserver. She smiled, but the smile came out strained, like a string on an old guitar. "Hello, Dr. Carter," she said, closing the door behind her. "Can I come to you for a minute?" "Of course, Susan," James nodded, returning to the table. "Take a seat." "What's happened?" Susan carefully lowered herself into a chair, placing her purse on her lap. She cleared her throat, straightened her hair, and began. "I was thinking, I probably need to change my pregnancy pills. The ones I drink are somehow not very suitable. My head hurts, my mood changes. Maybe you can recommend something else." James squinted as he opened her card. He remembered prescribing pills for Susan a couple of years ago, after she complained of nerves and unstable periods. Then everything was business as usual. She and Robert decided that they had enough children. Their daughter, Emily, was already in high school, and a year later Robert even had the procedure done to close the issue. James himself advised him before the procedure, and Robert then jokes, I'm officially retired from this business now, Doc. So why would Susan take the pills at all if her husband was already out of the game? It didn't make sense. What exactly worries you? He asked, trying to sound neutral. Are your headaches and mood caused by the pills or something else? Susan hesitated. She giggled nervously, fiddling with her purse strap, and said, well, it's spring. Everything is blooming. The mood is so changeable. James nodded silently, even though alarm bells were ringing in his head. He imagined Robert sitting by the lake with a fishing rod, wearing his old plaid shirt. He decided to dig deeper, but carefully so as not to scare her away. How long have you been feeling these side effects? He asked, looking into her eyes. And maybe there's something else that's bothering you. I'm not a gossip. Everything will remain between us. Susan giggled again, but now it sounded like the creaking of an ungreased door. She looked away, staring at the healthy eating poster on the wall, and muttered, no, nothing like that. It's just a headache, that's all. Maybe I drink too much coffee, or did you overdo it at the fitness club? Fitness club. There's that word again. James felt a chill run down his spine. First Margaret with her sauna, now Susan with her overdoing it. Liz also went to this club almost every evening. He remembered how she came back last week, flushed, with damp hair, and said, the sauna there, James, is just a dream. Then he only nodded, burying his face in the newspaper, but now this phrase sounded like an echo in an empty room. It's a fitness club, he repeated, trying not to give away his thoughts. So, are there a lot of people there? Oh, that's enough. Susan perked up, clearly pleased at the change of topic. And Liz is there, and Margaret, and Tom Wilson even drops by, can you imagine? Such noise, such fuss, just like a party. Tom Wilson. Another name that came up too often today. James remembered how Mrs. Henderson had been chatting about him this morning, saying that he was up to something grand. And now he's at the gym with Liz, Margaret, and Susan. Coincidence? James didn't believe in coincidences, especially in Hillsborough, where everyone knew each other down to the third generation. He wrote Susan a prescription for new pills, the same ones she asked for, but with a lower dosage so as not to harm. While he filled out the form, Susan continued to chatter. They also installed new exercise machines there. I tried it last week and almost fell. Liz supported me. It was such a funny story. James listened with half an ear, but his thoughts had already wandered away. He handed her the recipe, said the standard, drink as directed, and walked her to the door. When Susan left, he returned to the table and stared at the empty mug. The picture in his head was becoming clearer, and he didn't like it. He got up, went to the window, and looked out onto the street. Susan was just leaving the building, adjusting her purse. She stopped to answer the phone, and James noticed how she smiled, not the forced smile she had in the office, but a real one, almost flirtatious. She said something into the phone, laughed, and moved on, swaying her hips slightly. James narrowed his eyes. This was not the Susan he knew, and clearly not the one Robert knew. Returning to the table, he sat down and continued to think about Margaret's test results. They were supposed to come tomorrow. If what he thinks is confirmed there, it will not be just a coincidence. This will be a bomb waiting to explode right in the middle of Hillsborough, and Liz, his Liz, may be at the epicenter. James sighed, rubbed his temples, and muttered to himself. Spring. Damn spring. James Carter closed the clinic door, turning the key with a tired click. The day finally came to an end, leaving behind a stack of patient files, the smell of iodine, and a slight throbbing in the temples. The sun had set and Hillsborough was plunged into the soft twilight of evening. The streetlights along the main street came on, casting yellow stains on the cobblestones. Postman Jack walked past, dragging a bag of letters, and Miss Perkins was still dragging her dog General home, muttering to him something about ghosts at the bins. Somewhere the door to Tony's bar slammed, and James heard a faint murmur of voices. He slung his bag over his shoulder and walked to the house across the road, feeling the cool March air sting his face. At home, he was greeted by the smell of fried potatoes and garlic. Liz was in the kitchen. He heard her rattling a frying pan and humming something under her breath, a tune from an old coffee commercial. James hung his coat on the hook by the door, threw his bag on the sofa, and walked into the living room. Their house was small, but warm. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, the sofa with a rug looked like generations of cats had slept on it, and the bookcase was crammed with medical reference books and a couple of unread Liz novels. On the wall hung a photo from the Lakim and Liz, 5 years ago, with the wind in their hair and smiles. James glanced at her briefly and turned away. I didn't want to look at her today. "Are you home?" Liz shouted from the kitchen. Her voice was clear and a little too cheerful. "Dinner is almost ready. Go wash your hands." James chuckled to himself. "Wash your hands like I'm in kindergarten." But he obediently went into the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked in the mirror. Gray hair at his temples, tired eyes, wrinkles around his mouth. He looked as if he had gone not a day, but a week without sleep. Maybe this is a clinic, or those visits from Margaret and Susan that have been running through your head all day. He wiped his face with a towel and went to the kitchen, trying to get ready. It was necessary to behave naturally, as if nothing was happening. At least for now. Liz stood at the stove, stirring the potatoes. She was wearing a blue apron with daisies. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and there was a blush on her cheeks, either from the heat of the frying pan or from a good mood. She turned around and smiled at him, her eyes sparkling. "How's your day, Dr. Carter?" she asked, putting the frying pan on the table. "Did you save many sick people in the spring?" James sat down at the table, forcing himself to smile back. "As always," he said, picking up his fork. "Nothing new." Liz laughed, pouring water into glasses. Her laugh was light, but James sensed something forced in it, as if she was trying to sound more cheerful than she felt. She sat down opposite him, pushed a plate of potatoes and chicken towards him, and began chatting. "I was at the fitness club today. It was so busy. Mrs. Green tried to do the splits and almost broke the machine. Everyone laughed until they cried." James nodded, munching on his potato. He tried to look relaxed, but inside everything was tense. After Margaret with her sauna and Susan with her overdoing it, this place began to seem to him like some kind of epicenter of secrets. He decided to go in from the other side, carefully so as not to scare him away. "By the way, Margaret came by today," he said, looking at Liz over his glass. Liz froze for a second, the fork stopping in midair. But then she quickly smiled and waved her hand. "Margaret? I haven't seen her in ages, probably since last week." James squinted as he slowly chewed a piece of chicken. "I haven't seen you in 100 years?" Margaret said that she was at the club with Liz recently a couple of days ago, if not yesterday. He felt a chill stir in his chest. Is Liz lying? Or did Margaret get it wrong? He decided to check again, keeping his tone calm. "She said you steamed in the sauna together," he continued, as if matter-of-factly. "You seemed to go there?" Liz frowned, but then laughed, a little louder than usual. "Together? Well, she must have gotten it wrong. I was in the sauna, but not with Margaret. With someone else, probably Susan, a couple of days ago. I didn't meet Margaret there." James nodded, although his stomach tightened. Susan. Another name that flashed in his office today. He remembered her nervous laughter, her strange request to change his pills, her words about the fitness club. And now Liz says she was there with her. Coincidence? Maybe, but something told him that it was not so simple. He put down his fork and picked up his glass, taking a sip of water to hide his thoughtfulness. It was necessary to control oneself and not betray suspicion. Bye. Liz continued to chatter as if she hadn't noticed anything. "How are the potatoes?" she asked, pushing him to refill. "New recipe, I overheard it at the club. There, one woman told how to fry it with garlic. Delicious, right?" James nodded, swallowing his bite. "Delicious," he said. "Garlic is always a win-win." She smiled, clearly pleased with his answer, and began to talk further about the weather, about how Mrs. Green almost got stuck in the exercise machine, about the new class schedule. James listened with half an ear, nodding in the right places, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He looked at Liz, at her blush, at her animated gestures, and tried to understand what was wrong. She seemed the same as always, cheerful, a little fussy, with that usual humming of hers. But her words about Margaret haunted him. If she hadn't seen her for 100 years, why did Margaret mention her so confidently? And why did Liz change the subject so quickly? Dinner went on as usual. Liz clinked her fork, James chewed potatoes, the water in the glasses splashed quietly like a calm lake. He tried to keep the conversation going, throwing out short phrases. Yes, funny, Mrs. Green is in her repertoire. But inside his head was working like an old motor, turning over the facts. Margaret with her infection, Susan with her pills, Liz with her fitness club, and somewhere between them this club is like a connecting link. He didn't yet know what this meant, but he felt that something didn't add up. When the plates were empty, Liz stood up to clear the dishes. James also stood up, took his plate, and went to the sink. While he washed his fork, Liz stood nearby, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you going to the club tomorrow?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Probably," she answered, shrugging. "Are you late?" "Maybe," he said evasively. "Business at the clinic." She nodded without asking questions and turned to the stove, starting to hum again. James finished with the dishes, dried his hands, and went into the living room. Liz remained in the kitchen, her voice ringing about the sun and the moon. He sat on the sofa, looking out the dark window. The street lamp flickered, casting shadows on the curtains. The silence of the house was oppressive, despite Liz's humming. James leaned back, closed his eyes, and muttered to himself, "I haven't seen you for 100 years, that is." James Carter sat in his office. He rubbed his temples, trying to get last night out of his head. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. James shook himself, straightened his robe, and shouted, "Come in." The door creaked, and Carol Walker entered the office. James recognized her immediately, a short, slightly plump woman with short brown hair and a perpetual smile that seemed glued on. Her husband, Henry Walker, was a local bank clerk, as dull as a rainy Monday, with a face that looked like someone had forgotten to paint it. Carol held her purse with both hands, pressing it to her stomach, and looked like she wanted to sink into the ground. James narrowed his eyes. He knew Carol as a calm, practical woman who came once a year to check her blood pressure or ask about vitamins for her son. "Good morning, Dr. Carter," she said, closing the door and smiling awkwardly. "Can I come to you? On business?" "Good morning, Carol," James nodded, pointing to the chair. "Of course, sit down. What's bothering you?" Carol sat down, placing her purse on her lap, and began fiddling with its handle. Her cheeks turned pink, and her eyes darted around the office from the stethoscope on the table to the poster about healthy eating. She coughed, straightened her hair, and finally said, "I have, well, how should I say, an awkward situation. Very awkward." James put down his pen and folded his hands on the table, trying to look as professional as possible. He nodded, inviting her to continue. "Tell me," he said calmly. "Everything is confidential here." Carol swallowed, her fingers clutching her purse even tighter, and she spoke, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Anyway, I have. Something stuck there, and I don't know how to get it. This is so embarrassing, doctor." James froze, trying not to show surprise. He was used to strange requests, but this was something new. He coughed to hide a slight grin and asked, "When did this happen?" "Last night," Carol muttered, looking down. "Henry and I, well, we decided to add a little variety to our lives. 15 years of marriage and all that." James nodded, making a note on the card. Henry Walker. He remembered him, stooped, in a gray suit, with a voice that could make you fall asleep in the middle of a sentence. Henry was the kind of man whose idea of diversity was probably watching TV in the kitchen rather than the living room. James chuckled mentally. 15 years of marriage and suddenly condoms. Something doesn't fit here. But he remained silent for now, deciding to dig deeper. "Why condoms?" he asked, trying to sound neutral. "Everything seems to be stable between you and Henry." Carol blushed even more, her cheeks turning almost crimson. Well, it was a promotion at the supermarket, she blurted out. 2 for the price of 1. I thought, why not try? And colored ones, so? Pink. Henry said it was fun. James couldn't help but laugh. Pink condoms. Henry Walker. He imagined this sad clerk in a bank tie, choosing pink condoms in a supermarket, and almost choked on air. Is it fun? He thought. But out loud he only said, it's clear. Let me take a look at you and solve the problem. Carol nodded, although it was clear that she wanted to disappear. James pointed to the screen in the corner of the office and added, take off your clothes, I'll be right back. While Carol reluctantly stomped behind the screen, clothes rustling, James went out into the corridor to get gloves and tools. A swarm of thoughts was spinning in his head. Where does this newness come from all of a sudden? James shook his head. Something was wrong here. Returning to the office, he found Carol on the couch, covered with a sheet. Her purse lay next to her like a faithful guard. James put on gloves and began the examination. Trying not to look her in the eyes, he knew how awkward it was for patients. After a couple of minutes, he finished. Everything is ready, he said, returning to the table. You can get dressed. Carol breathed a sigh of relief, her face finally losing its crimson tint. Oh, thank you, doctor, she muttered, pulling on her clothes behind the screen. This is so awkward, you have no idea. James nodded, writing on the card. It happens, he said. The main thing is that everything is fine, but I would advise you and Henry to be careful with these stocks. Carol giggled as she stepped out from behind the screen. She sat back in her chair, straightened her hair, and said, yeah, nothing else like that. Henry probably isn't happy either. James smiled, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He still couldn't believe that Henry Walker, that gray bank mouse, had suddenly decided to diversify his sex life. It was as much his style as if old John had hung up and signed up for yoga. But he didn't say anything, yet he had to wait until Carol herself added something. And then her phone rang. Carol shuddered, reached into her purse, and pulled out an old device with a worn screen. She looked at the number, her face tensed, and she said quietly, oh, this is for me. I'll answer, okay? James nodded, although his stomach tightened. Carol went out into the corridor, but the door remained ajar, pressed the button, and raised the phone to her ear. Yes, Tom, hi, she said in a whisper, but loud enough for James to hear. I'm already at the doctor. Everything is fine. Don't worry. It's fast. Volume. The name hit James like a hammer on a nail. He froze, trying not to give himself away, and pretended to write something on a card. Tom Wilson, Carol continued to whisper. Yes, I'll be there soon. Okay, bye. She ended the call, put the phone back in her purse, and smiled at James, but the smile came out forced. It's for work, she said, clearly embarrassed. He asked where I was. James nodded, although he was seething inside. Colleague? Carol worked in the library, where her colleagues were Miss Edna with her gin and a couple of old ladies discussing books. There was no Tom there, and Tom Wilson definitely had nothing to do with the library. He was a businessman with palm tree shirts and a shark tattoo. James remembered Liz mentioning him at dinner yesterday. So funny, he spilled his coffee at the club. And now he's calling Carol, worried about her. Everything is fine? James asked, trying to sound indifferent. Yes, sure, Carol answered too quickly, standing up. Thank you, doctor, I'll go. How much do I owe? It's okay, it's covered by insurance, he said, walking her to the door. After Carol left, James returned to the table and stared at the empty mug. Pink condoms. Henry Walker. Tom's call. It didn't fit in my head. He got up, went to the window, and looked out onto the street. Carol walked down the sidewalk, still clutching her purse, her gait a little faster than usual. James Carter walked down the clinic corridor, clutching a folder with test results. The morning turned out to be hectic. The phone was ringing incessantly. Nurse Marge was confusing patient cards. James had just finished bandaging a farm boy who had managed to cut his hand on an old barrel and was now heading to his office to finally deal with what was in that folder. The last few days, his nerves were like taut strings. He pushed the office door open with his foot, entered, and threw the folder on the table. Instead of sitting down, he walked around the room, stretching his neck. He opened the folder, pulled out the first sheet, and began to read. Margaret Jensen. Smear, bacterial analysis, result, positive. James froze, his fingers clenching the paper a little tighter than necessary. He had expected this. Margaret's symptoms were too obvious. Irritation, burning, discharge. The sauna has nothing to do with it, no matter how hard she tries to pass it off as the truth. It was an infection, period. He put the sheet of paper on the table, ran his hand through his short graying hair, and chuckled mentally. A sauna, you say? More like a sauna with someone, Margaret. He took her card out of the drawer, opened it, and began to write. The diagnosis is confirmed. Prescribing antibiotics. Notify about partners. It was routine standard protocol for such occasions. But James knew Margaret. She will come tomorrow in her ridiculous hat with feathers, blush to her ears, and babble something about towels and steam. And he will have to ask, "Who were you with, Margaret?" He could already imagine her face, a mixture of shame and indignation, and almost smiled. This will not be a reception, but a one-man show. He put the card aside and took the next sheet. Carol Walker. James felt his insides tighten. He began to read. Smear, analysis, result positive. James slowly sank into his chair, placed the paper next to the first one, and stared at them like they were clues in a detective novel. 2 patients, 2 friends, 2 infections, the same disease. His brain began to work faster, going through the details like a doctor on his rounds. He stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled out an old medical reference book, a thick book with a worn cover that he had not opened since university. He didn't need to check anything, he already knew, but flipping through the pages was a habit that calmed his nerves. He opened the section on infections and skimmed the lines. It's sexually transmitted. Symptoms in 70% of women. Complications if left untreated. Nothing new. He slammed the book shut and threw it back into the closet. The facts were simple. Margaret and Carol caught it from someone. And this someone was the common link. James stood up, walked to the small refrigerator in the corner of the office, and pulled out a bottle of water. He had already had too much coffee today, and his heart was pounding like old John's after a pipe. He took a sip, feeling the cold water soothe his throat. It was necessary to act. Margaret and Carol need to be called, report the results, and prescribe treatment. But that was not all. He needed to understand how far this chain stretched. Susan, her visit with the pills now seemed even more suspicious. And Liz, he squeezed the bottle a little tighter, then set it on the table. No, he didn't want to think about Liz yet. Her name was like a thorn that he was afraid to pull out. He returned to the table, picked up the phone, and dialed Nurse Marge's number. Her voice on the phone was hoarse, as always too many cigarettes on the clinic porch. "Marge, this is Carter," he said. "Call Margaret Jensen and Carol Walker for an appointment tomorrow. Tell me the results have arrived. We need to discuss them." "Oh, Doc." Marge chuckled. "I'll call you. What should I tell them if they ask?" "Just say the tests are ready," he answered dryly. "And no gossip, Marge." She laughed and hung up. James knew that Marge loved to talk, but at the clinic she kept her mouth shut, at least for now. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling. Tomorrow won't be easy, and he'll have to ask about partners. He imagined this conversation and almost groaned. He took both results sheets and put them in a folder. The evidence lay before him, black and white. 2 women, 1 infection, 1 town. Coincidence excluded. James remembered Ron's words about the love epidemic and nodded mentally. It looks like spring in Hillsborough has brought not only snowdrops, but also something more serious. And this something began to look like a network in which he had not yet seen all the nodes. He stood up, walked to the door, and opened it, letting in fresh air from the corridor. James Carter pushed open the door of the house, feeling the fatigue of the day squeeze his chest like a tight corset. Liz stood at the stove, stirring something with a wooden spoon. She was wearing a short t-shirt and sweatpants. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and a thin chain glittered around her neck, a gift from him for her last anniversary. She turned around, noticing him, and her face lit up with a sly smile. "Well, finally, my hero," she said, putting down the spoon and wiping her hands on a towel. "I thought you decided to spend the night at the clinic." James chuckled, leaning on the doorframe. "It was a hell of a day," he muttered, rubbing his neck. "I barely carried my legs away." She stepped towards him, her bare feet padding across the linoleum, and a familiar sparkle lit up in her eyes. Liz leaned closer, scenting him with the scent of perfume sweet, with a hint of vanilla, and placed her hand on his chest. "Hellish, you say?" she cooed, her fingers sliding to the buttons of his shirt. "Maybe I can relax you. I have a couple of ideas." James tensed, feeling her warmth penetrate the fabric. Normally, he would have given in her touch was like a balm after a long day. But not today. After Margaret and Carol, after their tests, after that Tom, who called Carol, he couldn't. Fear, cold and sticky, squeezed his throat. What if Liz did too? He swallowed, stepped back, and coughed loudly, putting his hand to his mouth. "Liz, I think I'm sick," he squeezed out, taking another step back. "Sore throat, fever, all that. I don't want to infect you." She froze, her hand hanging in the air and her eyebrows flying up. "Are you sick?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "You were fine this morning." "What? Just so suddenly?" James nodded, coughing again for emphasis, and rubbed his forehead as if checking his temperature. "Yes, it hit me at the end of the day," he lied, looking away. "Spring, viruses. Better stay away." Liz narrowed her eyes at him like a cat at a suspicious mouse, but then shrugged. "Okay, my dear," she chuckled, returning to the stove. "Will you have some soup, or straight to bed, sufferer?" "To bed," he muttered, feeling the lie burning his tongue. "My head is still pounding." She snorted, but did not argue, throwing over her shoulder. "Then get well, doctor, and don't snore, otherwise I'll throw you on the sofa." James forced a weak smile and went into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. He collapsed on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling, where the shadows of the street lamp drew patterns. "My heart was pounding, my palms were sweating." He lied. There was no cold. But he couldn't let Liz touch him, not after what he'd found out. What if she's in it too? He clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his skin. No, he was not ready to check it. Not now. He lay there for an hour, maybe more, listening to Liz rattle the dishes and then turn off the kitchen light. She entered the bedroom, took a quick look at him, and lay down on the other side of the bed, muttering. "Good night, patient." "Calm," he whispered, closing his eyes. Sleep came quickly, but it was heavy, full of fragments. He woke up later, when the morning was already breaking through the curtains, filling the room with gray light. The clock on the nightstand showed 7:30. Liz wasn't there, her pillow was crumpled. Her blanket had been thrown away. James sat up, rubbing his face, and heard the faint sound of running water coming from the bathroom. She was taking a shower. He stood up, feeling his body aching from the uncomfortable position, and wandered to the door to grab a clean shirt from the closet in the hallway. But passing by the bathroom, he froze. The door was ajar, and through the sound of the water, he heard Liz's voice, quiet but distinct. She was talking on the phone. James stopped, his heart pounding. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor. Her voice was soft, soothing, with a hint of impatience. "Yes, Margaret, I understand," she said, and James tensed at the name. "Why are you panicking so much? The results will come and everything will become clear." Pause. The sound of the water drowned out the answer, but Liz continued. "Listen, don't beat yourself up. Everything is fine with me, you know. It was just some kind of irritation, I'm sure." James didn't say anything like that, but he would have noticed. James felt the blood rush to his face. Irritation. Hers. His mind spun like a whirlwind. Did she also get tested? Or are they just words? He pressed himself against the wall, trying to breathe more quietly, although his heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of his chest. "Margaret, seriously," Liz's voice became a little sharper. You're always making mountains out of molehills. If there was something, I would be the first to run to the doctor. Calm down already. Tomorrow you will find out everything. Another pause. James heard a faint sob from the other side. Margaret was clearly on the edge. Liz sighed, her tone softening. Everything will be fine, do you hear? She said. It's just nerves. Have some tea, put on your stupid hat, and relax. Okay, bye. I have to go. The sound of the water intensified. She put down the phone. James backed away from the wall, feeling his legs give way. He quickly walked to the closet, grabbed a shirt, and returned to the bedroom, closing the door. His hands shook as he pulled the fabric over his shoulders. Irritation? At Liz's? She said it so confidently, as if she knew more than she let on. But if she was irritated, why didn't she tell him, the doctor, her husband? And why is Margaret panicking and Liz calm? He sat on the edge of the bed, holding his head in his hands. Emotions were overflowing: fear, anger, confusion. He remembered her touch yesterday, her playful tone, and he felt sick. What if she's hiding it? The bathroom door slammed, and he heard Liz's footsteps down the hallway. She walked into the bedroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair wet, and smiled at him. "Oh, you're awake," she said cheerfully. "How does the patient feel?" James looked up, forcing himself to answer. "Better," he said hoarsely, standing up. "I'll go wash myself." She nodded, reaching into the closet for some clothes. "Will you have breakfast?" she shouted after him. "Later," he muttered, going into the bathroom. Closing the door behind him, he turned on the water and stared at the mirror. His face was pale, eyes red, as if after a sleepless night. He heard her words again and again. "I'm fine, it's just irritation." He splashed water on his face, feeling the cold burn his skin. "I had to hold on. Margaret and Carol will come for the results, and he will find out more." But now he stood here, trembling with fear and anger, and whispered into the void. "What are you hiding, Liz?" James Carter stood at the kitchen sink, washing the remains of oatmeal off his plate. The morning was gray, with the smell of rain that drummed on the roof at night. He barely came to his senses after eavesdropping on Liz in the bathroom. For James, it was chaos. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. He needed to act. Liz left the bedroom. She yawned, threw the phone on the sofa, and plopped down next to him, looking at him with a slight smile. "Good morning, patient," she said, stretching. "How's your throat? Still itchy?" James wiped his hands on a towel, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, better," he muttered, coughing for emphasis, "but still not in shape." She chuckled, crossing her legs on the couch. "What do you have for today? Save Hillsborough." He turned to her, feeling his heartbeat a little faster. It was a moment. He swallowed, threw the towel on the table, and said, "Actually, Liz, I have a business trip today. We need to go to a neighboring city for a seminar on new protocols. I'll be back tonight or tomorrow morning." Liz froze, her hands stopping on the armrest, and her eyebrows shooting up. "Business trip?" she asked again, her voice becoming a little sharper. "You didn't say anything before." "They called from the clinic this morning," he lied, looking into her eyes. "It's an urgent matter. Some expert is coming. Don't get away with it." She squinted, tilting her head to the side. "In the morning?" She chuckled. "It's somehow strange. You were there all day yesterday. No one called." James shrugged, feeling the lie slide across his tongue like butter. "They called early. You were still sleeping," he said, looking away to the sink. "I decided not to wake you up." Liz snorted, but didn't argue, reaching for her phone. "Okay, go ahead if you have to," she said, her tone becoming casual. He nodded, feeling his insides clench. This was his chance. He had no intention of going anywhere. He'll stay in Hillsborough to keep an eye on her. Her annoyance, her confidence in talking to Margaret, her fitness club, all of these were like thorns under the skin. He needed the truth, and he decided to get it today. He walked to the closet in the hallway, pulled out a backpack, and began throwing things into it: a shirt, socks, a toothbrush. Liz watched him, lazily scrolling through the screen. "You look like you're on an expedition," she laughed. Her voice rang, but there was something strained in it. It's only for a day. Habit, he muttered, stuffing the charger into his side pocket. I don't like surprises. She chuckled, her gaze sliding over him with slight disbelief. He left, feeling her eyes follow him to the door. The street greeted him with dampness and a weak wind, blowing leaves along the wet asphalt. James walked a few steps, turned a corner, and stopped, looking back. Liz didn't look out the window good. He took out his phone and dialed the clinic number. Marge, this is Carter, he said when the nurse answered the phone in her smoky voice. I'm on a business trip today, so I canceled all my appointments. If something is urgent, call. Business trip? Marge asked hoarsely. What about your patients? Is Margaret there, Carol? James clutched the phone, feeling the cold creep under his jacket. Tell me how I have a business trip and the reception will be postponed until tomorrow, he said quickly. I'll sort it out. Okay, Doc, whatever you say, Marge chuckled. Don't catch a cold there, otherwise yesterday's patient was unconvincing. He hung up the call, put the phone in his pocket, and walked to his pickup truck parked behind the barn. Liz thought he would take the sedan, but he would leave it at the house to make it seem believable. The pickup truck old, with peeling paint, was his cover. He climbed inside, threw his backpack on the seat, and started the engine. The engine coughed, but started running, and James drove into the back road, away from the neighbor's eyes. He headed toward the outskirts of the Green Pine Motel, a shabby place with a crooked sign and an empty parking lot. The plan was simple: pretend to leave and keep an eye on Liz. She mentioned yoga at the club that night, but after her conversation with Margaret, he didn't believe a word she said. He needed to see with his own eyes what she was doing, who she was dating, what she was hiding. The motel appeared around the corner, a low building with cracked plaster and a damp smell. James parked behind the trees, turned off the engine, and leaned back in his seat. His heart was pounding and his palms were sweating. It was crazy. He, a doctor, a husband, turned into a spy who hides in a pickup truck and lies to everyone. But he couldn't help it. He needed the truth, even if it crushed him. He took out his phone and texted Liz, I'm leaving now until the evening. She answered a minute later, Good luck, doctor. James gritted his teeth as he stared at the screen. He put the phone back and got out of the car, slamming the door. The cold air hit his face, but he didn't notice. His thoughts were elsewhere. He got to the alley behind their house and hid there, feeling like a fool and a hunter at the same time. He waited, his heart pounding, his breathing coming in short gasps. Liz came out an hour later, a sports bag on her shoulder, her hair in a ponytail, her step fast and confident. She got into the car and drove away without looking back. James exhaled, feeling the tension give way to determination. He didn't know where she was going, to the club or something else, but he would find out. He followed her, keeping his distance, ready for this day to change everything he knew. He whispered to himself, It's time to find out, Liz, what you're hiding. Liz drove through the central part of the city, passing Mrs. Henderson's favorite bakery and a modest hardware store. Then she turned behind the church, where James expected to see a fitness club, the standard route she always referred to. But to his surprise, Liz drove further, beyond the outskirts, towards the old dacha plots. There, a couple of kilometers from the highway, stood the large country house of Tom Wilson, the local king of life, who was mentioned every now and then in gossip related to the fitness club. So this is it, James thought, gripping the steering wheel. There was little doubt that was where Liz was heading. Soon he stopped the pickup near a hedge overgrown with greenery and turned off the engine. Tom Wilson's house was too beautiful for the province, large, with wide windows decorated with heavy curtains. There were several cars parked in the yard, and when James recognized one of them, he felt a painful pang. It was Susan's car. The second car, judging by the license plates, belonged to Margaret Jensen. This is where your training takes place, he thought bitterly. The fence around the site was not too high, but the metal gates closed tightly. Fortunately, behind the house there was a strip of forest. There, among the bushes, it was possible to sneak closer and, perhaps, look inside. James got out of the pickup, took his binoculars from the back seat and made his way around. Everything felt absurd. A respected doctor, a man trusted in the city with health and secrets, was now sneaking through the bushes to catch his wife in betrayal. But he had no other opportunity to find out the truth. Asked directly, and they all admitted it. The backyard was separated from the forest only by a modest chain-link fence through which one could see part of the site. Luxurious flower beds, a grill placed under a canopy, and then a wide terrace with wooden decking. James crept towards the net, trying not to disturb a twig. Music could be heard from the terrace, dull bass, interrupted by bursts of women's laughter and men's voices. Through the foliage he made out a pair of figures standing near a table with bottles. Soon more people appeared on the terrace, women in short dresses, men in t-shirts or untucked shirts. The clatter of glasses, laughter, jokes. And among them is Liz. She stood with her shoulder pressed against Margaret, both holding glasses of what was obviously wine or champagne. They looked relaxed and cheerful. Susan, somewhere a little further away, was also laughing at Tom's jokes. He was easily recognizable by his wife, athletic figure, and the deliberately expensive watch on his wrist. James quietly brought the binoculars closer to his eyes. His heart sank. He saw Liz leaning towards Margaret, saying something quickly and excitedly, and she nodded and lightly touched her shoulder with her palm. At other times, this might seem like a normal gesture from girlfriends, but now he knew about their common secrets. The conversation was interrupted when Tom approached Liz with another glass. He said something and Liz responded by laughing and swaying her hips a little. Tom didn't seem to stop at pleasantries. He put his hand on her waist, ran his fingers through her ponytail, and tilted his head slightly, as if about to whisper something in her ear. Liz responded with a smile and a mocking, pushing away gesture that was more playful than truly intimidating. At that moment, something broke in James's chest. Yes, for now it might look like flirting at a drunken party where everyone loses their boundaries a little. But he knew it wasn't just flirting. He saw the look on Liz's face, not disgust, but rather anticipation. And Tom looked at her not as a random guest, but as a woman with whom he might already have something. The party continued. Another man walked along the terrace with an unbuttoned shirt and a hefty amount of tattoos. James didn't recognize him apparently, Tom's friend from a neighboring town. Margaret and Susan moved to the edge of the terrace, and Liz remained with Tom, who pulled her somewhere deeper into the house. The music inside was louder, and flashes of colored lights came through the window. Perhaps Tom had set up some kind of mini club or dance floor there. We need to come closer, James decided, realizing that through the terrace he would no longer be able to see what was happening inside. He moved along the net, trying not to make a sound. Scraps of thoughts rushed through my head. What am I doing? Maybe we should break in there and find out everything. But he understood that he was not ready for the public stage. Finally, he found a place where he could see a window without curtains. It turned out to be the side of the house, next to the stairs to the second floor. Fortunately, there were enough creeping plants to provide cover, and James carefully raised himself up, peering into the rectangle of the window. There was indeed a kind of dance floor inside. The room was illuminated by multicolored light bulbs. The furniture was pushed back against the walls, and several people were dancing on the floor. Among them, he recognized Liz and Tom. To the rhythmic music, Tom pressed her to him by the hips, and she, throwing her head back, laughed. The closeness of their bodies was too obvious to leave hope for the innocent nature of the relationship. Suddenly Liz, breaking away from Tom, took his hand and pulled him somewhere towards the door, apparently into the next room. Tom didn't resist for a second. They disappeared from view, leaving James in a state of near shock. He felt the ground seemed to be disappearing from under his feet. My legs trembled, my hands shook, and my heart was pounding so hard that the binoculars were bouncing against my chest. There was no longer any doubt about Liz's loyalty. He saw with his own eyes how she voluntarily left with Tom away from prying eyes. James swallowed convulsively, realizing the full extent of the betrayal. But he was not going to rush in there with his fists now. After waiting a few more minutes until the noise and laughter in the house became very loud, James backed away towards his bushes, trying not to get tangled in the mesh wire. When he managed to get out into the forest belt and reach the pickup truck, he sat behind the wheel, leaned forward, and covered his face with his hands. Reality hits him like an avalanche. Liz is cheating on him. And she's not alone, Susan. Margaret and Carol are also caught up in a web of lies, possibly with a whole bunch of men. "This is the most disgusting day of my life," he whispered, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Trembling, he started the engine and drove back into town, trying to stay off the main road so as not to cross paths with Liz or any of Tom's guests. A plan was already forming in his head. He would not create a cheap drama right now. He would do everything competently and calmly. As a doctor, as a person who knows that truth is more important than emotions. "I'll go back to the city," he said to himself out loud, "and I'll bring them all to light." Returning home, James felt that he was too nervous to easily maintain the appearance of ordinary life. He needed to cool down and think about his next step. That's why he didn't go straight into the house. Liz obviously wasn't there, and it was still early, which meant she would stay at the party until the evening or even later. Instead, James drove to the parking lot of the city park where mothers with strollers usually walked in the mornings and got out of the pickup truck. A quiet March breeze blew across his face, trying to at least a little dispel the chaos in his head. The alleys were almost empty, with only a couple of runners trotting to the side. James sat down on a nearby bench and bowed his head, closing his eyes. A picture pulsed in my brain. Shock and pain cut into his soul. But he could not allow himself to cry or become powerless. It was necessary to act. "What's next?" he asked himself. "How can I expose everyone without completely ruining my own reputation?" After all, in a small town, rumors spread like wildfire. He had already seen how the outbreak of a scandal could burn everything around to the ground. However, he had a trump card: test results and the status of a doctor, allowing him to officially ask patients about contacts. Professional ethics in the event of infection with an infectious disease requires the doctor to notify all persons who could become a carrier of the infection. In other words, James' medical duty is to find out who came into close contact with whom. "This is it," he decided. "I will make an official call to everyone who has identified symptoms or risks, and I'll make them name their partners. Then the whole network of lies will emerge." He understood that Liz would be among the names, otherwise explain why the same Margaret, Carol, perhaps Susan, became infected, and his wife was included in their company. But this path was cruel. Their husbands would also come under attack. James thought of Robert, the quiet gym teacher who had no idea what his wife Susan was doing, and Henry, the sad clerk who tried to add diversity to his relationship with Carol. All these men can find out the truth in the most painful way. But James saw no other way. He could not allow an epidemic to spread through the city. If he had simply incriminated Liz verbally, it would have turned into a personal matter and a scandal that would have had no objective evidence. This is a medical necessity. Perhaps someone will not believe him and will accuse him of revenge, but official analyses speak for themselves. With these thoughts in mind, James walked to the edge of the park and, noticing a rusty trash can, threw a crumpled paper cup from his pickup into it. He looked at the phone. No calls, not from Liz or anyone else. On the one hand, this suited him. The less talk now, the better. On the other hand, resentment was tossing in my soul. She's not even worried about where I am. Although perhaps Liz had already read his message about the business trip and decided that she had the whole night ahead of her to return without arousing suspicion. James drove all the way home, feeling pain and cold rage mixing in his chest. He did not sit and be tormented by thoughts for a long time. Instead, he went to the office, the same room on the second floor, where he sometimes received urgent patients at home and where he kept duplicate medical histories. He turned on the computer and opened the folder with the test data. Familiar names appeared before his eyes. Margaret, Carol, a couple of other patients whom he had not previously suspected could be involved in this. "I'll confront them all with a fait accompli," he decided, "and I'll ask you to fill out a contact form for the last month. This is not just my personal business, it is preventing the spread of diseases." He understood that the women would be shocked. But there is no other way. If everything is left as is, they will continue to lie and infect. And if you try to resolve everything privately, you risk not getting to the bottom of the whole truth. Who knows how many other people are involved? He asked himself bitterly. Hour after hour passed in preparation. James sketched out a template for an exposure notification on the computer in which the patient must indicate who he had been intimate with in the past 30 days. From a medical point of view, this is a standard procedure for detecting sexually transmitted diseases. From the point of view of social life, Hillsborough is a time bomb, because as soon as these papers reach the women's desk, panic will begin. In the evening, James heard a car pull up outside the house. He went to the window. Liz had returned. The sedan stopped, headlights streaking across the walls of the living room. A few seconds later, the door slammed, and Liz entered the house cheerful, excited, but trying to hide it. She still had a thin layer of makeup on her face, and her hair was slightly tousled, as if after a long hug or active dance. "Hello," she said, seeing James standing on the threshold of the office. "How was your business trip? I thought you'd be back tomorrow." There was a slight wariness in Liz's voice. Apparently, she did not expect to find him at home. James looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Was there a trace of guilt on her face, or just surprise? "Sorry I didn't warn you," he managed. "The seminar was postponed. It turned out that the expert did not come, so I'm back." He didn't make a scene right now, although everything was seething inside him. Liz nodded, pretending not to notice the strange look in his eyes. She went into the bedroom to change clothes, saying something neutral about tired. It was a crazy day. James heard her close the door. He understood that sooner or later he would have to talk to her directly, but he decided to wait for his official action. While Liz was in the bedroom, he went down to the living room and sat on the sofa. His gaze slid over the family photographs on the shelf, at the lake, at a holiday reception, at a wedding 15 years ago. How everything has changed, he thought bitterly. He remembered her laughter, her happy eyes in old photographs, and he compared it to the Liz I saw today, clinging to Tom Wilson. The hot look she gave to him, not her husband, came to mind. He was struck by the contrast. It was not just an affair, it was betrayal before his eyes. And now she still dares to pretend to be tired of fitness. He clenched his fists, but pulled himself together. The time for confrontation would come. While he was waiting, pretending to read the newspaper, a short ringing sound came from Liz's phone from the bedroom. She quickly picked up the phone, and James heard out of the corner of his ear, "Yes, I'm home. Everything is fine." "No, don't worry." He didn't notice anything. Then silence. What a lie there is, James thought, feeling a firm decision to act growing inside him. And so the day ended, bringing him a shocking discovery. The next morning, James woke up before Liz. Or rather, he didn't really sleep. He spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, thinking about his plan. By 6 in the morning, he was already at the clinic, unlocking the door and sitting down in his office at the table with the papers he had prepared yesterday. Nurse Marge, surprised by his early appearance, muttered something like, "Today you are definitely earlier than everyone else," and disappeared into the reception area. James made himself a black coffee, set the mug on the windowsill, and stared at the stack of sheets prepared for the patients. At the bottom, next to the signatures and seals, was a mention of the state's Infectious Disease Control Act. At 8 in the morning, the first patient came to the clinic, Mrs. Green, who, however, had nothing to do with this story. She complained of sprains after dancing. James quickly examined her, prescribed ointment, and told her not to overexert herself. Mrs. Green left, leaving behind the smell of pink perfume. Then Marge, looking into the office, said, "Doc, Margaret came here and said you called her. Should I skip it or wait?" James clenched his teeth. "Well, let's start with her," he thought. "Let him come in, Marge." A minute later, Margaret Jensen flew into the office, still wearing the same eccentric hat with feathers, this time even more absurd bright purple. She looked nervous, her eyes darted around. She sat down in a chair, putting her purse on her lap, and forced a smile. Good morning, Dr. Carter. Hello, Margaret, James replied, opening her card. How are you? She swallowed, looking at the door. You said to come, the test results? Yes, he nodded. I guess I'll get straight to the point. You have been diagnosed with, he paused, a disease. You need therapy, and most importantly, find out who your sexual partner is, in accordance with the protocol. Margaret turned pale. What? Yes, no. She suddenly fell silent, looking at the form that James began to pull out of the folder. Is this, is this some kind of form? Yes, a medical document, he emphasized. For such diseases, we are required to maintain a contact list to prevent further spread. Please fill out, who exactly will you indicate as a partner for the last month? Margaret's face showed horror. She frantically grabbed the pen, but her hand was shaking. James noticed a bead of sweat slide down her forehead. A month, she whispered. Doctor, can we talk about this without papers? You know, in Hillsborough, everyone knows each other. Sorry, but no, he answered firmly. This is the law and professional duty. In addition, your disease can be transmitted further if your partner is not examined and does not receive treatment. Margaret closed her eyes. It was clear that she was trying to find words. Tom, she finally said quietly, and her eyes filled with tears. Tom Wilson. No one else in a month. The first step has been taken, James mentally said to himself, experiencing bitter satisfaction. He handed her the paper. Fine. Write down in the section, Theo contact person's full name, if known, and the date of last contact. Margaret's fingers trembled. She made 2 short notes, then looked pleadingly at James. You won't tell your husband. Henry shouldn't know. He will kill me. You are a doctor. You have a secret. At this moment, James was forced to lie only partly. Henry is your husband and the legal representative of your interests, and due to medical confidentiality, we do not disclose information without the patient's consent. However, by law, I am obliged to transfer it to the authorized bodies if necessary. Margaret bit her lip, crumpled the handkerchief in her hand, and, sobbing, quickly left without even saying goodbye. James stayed in his office, put the completed form in a separate folder, and made a note. Margaret Jensen, partner Tom Wilson. That's it. Now it's officially documented. Before lunch, the situation repeated itself several more times. Carol Walker, trembling and blushing, named the same Tom and only him, according to her. One young woman, who had not previously been on Liz's list of close friends, but also tested positive, admitted that she had an affair with some guy at Tom's party. She doesn't remember his name. One way or another, the threads led to Tom Wilson. It seemed that this guy managed to sleep in half the city. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, James looked at the completed forms. The name Tom Wilson appeared more than once, sometimes supplemented, at a fitness club, at a house party, on a trip to a neighboring town. The picture was ominous. It seems that Tom played the role of a kind of host of the holiday, where drinking and promiscuity became the norm, and women, exhausted by the routine of the province, found something new in this entertainment, forgetting about their husbands and risking their health. And then James found himself thinking, will anyone mention Liz on the list? My heart started beating faster. He picked up the last few papers, not a word about Liz. But James had no doubt that Liz was involved. And yet it was not black and white. It was almost 4 when the office door opened again, and Susan, Robert's wife, the one who asked to change the pills, appeared on the threshold. Seeing her pale face and the absence of her former radiant smile, James realized. She knew everything about the scandal with the tests. Sit down, Susan, he nodded. I need to talk to you seriously. She sat down on a chair, folding her hands in her lap. I'm ready for bad news, doctor, she said, flexing her fingers nervously. This is something serious, right? Alas, yes, James admitted, opening her card. Your tests showed the presence of infection. You need to undergo treatment and fill out a form indicating all partners for the last month. Susan covered her face with her hands, groaning. Oh God, Robert will kill me. I don't. I don't know what to do now. James understood her condition, but could not show gentleness. The stakes are too high. Susan, he said evenly, I must ask you for names. Otherwise, we will not be able to stop the spread. Your husband may also be at risk if you had sex after you got sick. Susan sobbed. Robert. He and I have hardly slept together for a long time. He's always fishing, and well, she blushed. Tom, he was so. Bright, or what? I'm just confused. Do you want to point out Tom Wilson? James clarified, although he no longer doubted the answer. Susan nodded, furrowing her brow. Yes, and also. She bit her lip. James raised an eyebrow. Someone else? Yes, his friend. I don't know the name. At a party in a country house. It was a one-time thing. I was drunk. She almost burst into tears. James sighed. So Tom's friends are also in on it. But he restrained his emotions. Okay, at least write down that unknown man, party at Tom Wilson's on such and such a date. We'll try to find out his identity through Wilson. Susan automatically reached for the pen. Having filled out the paper, she handed it to James and said in a barely audible voice, Doctor. And Liz, she too. She stopped, looking at him in fear. What Liz? He asked coldly. Susan bit her lip. She didn't seem to want to talk directly about the doctor's wife, but the question was already hanging in the air. Finally, Susan burst out. I don't know, I didn't see her in bed with Tom. But I know that they communicate. We'll find out later, James snapped, lowering his gaze to her paper. You need to start a course of antibiotics right away. The reception ended there. Susan came out staggering, as if all her energy had been drained from her, and James was left looking at the completed form, which included Tom and unknown another anonymous source of infection. He put the form down and rubbed his tired eyes. The plan has entered a decisive phase. He already had a whole folder of names and confessions, official, written in the patient's handwriting. He knew that this was a real bomb. If he wanted it, all this information would become the property of the authorities, husbands, and the entire town. But for now, he decided to wait, to collect all the facts together, including waiting for Liz to speak or give up. Tomorrow I'll talk to my husband, James thought, looking at the tired reflection in the closet mirror. If these women are sleeping with Tom, then their husbands should know. And if it turns out that Liz is on the list, I will present her betrayal publicly. It will be scary, but there is no other way. It was already 7 in the evening. James walked out of the office into the empty corridor of the clinic, pausing at the window. In the light of the lanterns, the paving stones glistened from the recent rain, and the main street was unusually quiet. The calm before the storm, he thought bitterly, and he stepped towards the exit to close the clinic for the night. The next morning, James got up with the firm intention of talking to the husbands of those women who had confirmed, or at least strongly suspected contacts with Tom Wilson. Perhaps, from the point of view of medical ethics, it seemed controversial to disclose information that patients provided during a confidential conversation, but he relied on rules to prevent the spread. Yes, the direct indication of names may be questionable, but we were talking about the health of the entire town, and especially about the sanity of the unfortunate deceived husbands who are at risk of becoming infected or have already become infected. After finishing with a quick cup of coffee, he collected some papers without obvious signatures, but with hints of dates and circumstances, put them in a folder and went to their addresses. The first was Robert, Susan's husband. He could be found at school, where he taught physical education. Approaching the entrance to the old brick building, James found a change. Teenagers were rushing along the corridor, making noise and laughing. The ball was clapping loudly in the gym. James entered there and saw Robert, a tall man with short crew-cut hair. He stood leaning against the wall bars, explaining something to the students. Robert, James called out to him. He turned around and smiled, although the smile was slightly strained. James, hello, what are you doing? Anything urgent? We need to talk. Alone, James said. Better now. Robert frowned, called his assistant, and told him to look after the students. When they went out into the corridor, where it was a little quieter, Robert asked, "What's happened? Susan, is there something wrong with her? Did you know that she came to my clinic recently?" James began, trying to keep his voice even. "She discovered health problems." Robert's face turned pale. "Crap. What's wrong with her? She didn't say anything." James realized that he would have to choose his words, but it would still be a blow. "Robert, your wife has been diagnosed with an infection. I can't name all the details, but her tests are positive, and she listed Tom Wilson in her contacts." He said this quietly so that no one would hear, but horror and anger immediately flashed in Robert's eyes. "Oh, she. Damn it. I couldn't even think." A thud echoed in the corridor. A couple of curious schoolchildren opened the door, but when they saw the teacher's distorted face, they quickly disappeared. Robert clenched his fists, trying to control his emotions. "I'm sorry to tell you this like this," James added, "but you should know. Perhaps you need to get tested too. And Robert, I have no right to hide this, otherwise everything will only get worse." "Of course I will," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Where is Tom? I'll break his jaw." Robert's voice trembled with rage. James touched his shoulder. "I understand your condition, but please don't do anything thoughtless. It's important to understand everything. There are other women who have the same situation, and not just Susan." "God, this is all. God, what a nightmare," said Robert, pressing his palm to his forehead. "Okay, where can I get tested?" James explained that he could take blood samples and a swab at the clinic and set up a time. Robert listened and nodded, but it was clear that his thoughts were already far away, filled with hatred of Tom and disappointment in Susan. "I'll come," he promised. "Thank you for saying." James nodded and left the school, feeling his heart become even heavier. One husband is already suffering, and this is just the beginning. Next, he went to Henry Walker. He found him at the bank, a small branch where Henry worked as a clerk. James asked the administrator to let him in to see Henry on a personal matter. He, having learned that Dr. Carter himself had come, did not hesitate for long. Henry found himself in a tiny nook that looked more like a filing cabinet than a private office. Inside there was a strong smell of paper and printer toner. Henry smiled shyly when he saw James. "Doctor, hello. Can I help you with something?" James didn't beat around the bush. "Henry, I came not as a patient, but as a doctor who must warn you. I can't divulge details, but your wife, Carol, she contracted the disease and listed a man other than you in her contacts." Henry blinked at first, as if he didn't understand, and then a range of emotions were reflected on his face: shock, disbelief, pain. Is this some kind of joke? Carol? He was confused. "We have an ordinary life without such tricks." "I know," James said quietly, "but the facts speak for themselves. You also need to be examined to rule out infection." Henry smiled wryly and seemed suddenly angry. "No, wait. Maybe you are confusing something. Carol is not like that. She would never." James realized that Henry's shock would turn into denial, but he had to continue. "Sorry, but she confirmed it herself. I'm saying this for your health, and I recommend that you talk to her directly." Henry gripped the armrests of his chair until his fingers turned white. His face became long and pale, his eyes began to wander. We. Henry swallowed convulsively. "Okay, I will come to the clinic." There was nothing more to say. James left the bank branch, leaving Henry in a state of deep prostration. He didn't like the role of messenger of bad news, but he couldn't help it. "Let the husbands know," he firmly repeated to himself. "That's fair." A little later, he met with two more husbands, but he left the hardest thing for last: Tom Wilson, the epicenter of this epidemic. James didn't plan to be nice to Tom. He understood that this self-confident guy might try to deny or mock everything. But the doctor had proof, official forms with Tom's name on them. Perhaps he will be able to intimidate him with the demands of the law, so that he reveals the names of all his possible partners and associates. I have authority, after all, James reminded himself. This is not a joke. Finding Tom was not difficult. He was hanging around the fitness club, checking the installation of new advertising. It was there, in the parking lot, that James waylaid him in the afternoon. "Hi, Tom," he greeted coldly, getting out of the car. He turned around and squinted, clearly not expecting the visit. Thin, but pumped up, with tattoos on his arms and a bright smile. He looked relaxed and confident. "Oh, Dr. Carter, what kind of people? Why so official?" Tom smiled, and mockery flashed in his gaze. "I need to talk," James said, "in private." Tom adjusted his baseball cap, shooing away the worker who was working on the banner. They moved aside to the corner of the building. "I'm listening." Tom spread his hands. "Several women with the disease came to my clinic," James began, looking him straight in the eye. "They called you their partner. I have documents to support their claims. It looks like you are the source of the infection. I need you to get tested too and tell me who else you had contact with." Tom looked at him silently for a second and then suddenly laughed. The laughter was loud and brazen. "Come on, doctor. Are you spying on my personal life? Or are you jealous? Everything is fine with testing. I regularly take tests in another city. This is some kind of duck." "I don't think so," James muttered, feeling anger boiling inside him. "Too many coincidences. If you do not undergo the examination voluntarily, I will be forced to contact the authorities." Tom stopped laughing and his eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, imposingly and threateningly. "You're threatening, right? Look, Carter, I can't be intimidated. If you reveal something, then dirt will pour on your wife, understand?" A chill ran down James' spine. "I don't care about your threats," he managed, trying to maintain his composure. "And yes, you shouldn't have brought my wife here." Tom snorted. "How could it be in vain? Are you blind?" James's fists clenched. He wanted to hit Tom, but he restrained himself with all his strength. "It's none of your business," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm doing my job, and if you don't pass the test, I will inform the health authorities that you are a distributor, and then they will take you more seriously." Tom winced. It was clear that the prospect of an official inspection frightened him a little more. "Okay, Carter, let's calm down." He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I'll pass your test, no problem. But just without making too much noise, okay? And in general, maybe your women are lying to protect themselves. They will also say that I have a harem." "So, tomorrow at the clinic at 9, James said harshly, "and prepare a list of all the women with whom you have had contact over the past month. Otherwise, it will only get worse." "Fuck you," Tom muttered, turned around and walked back to the workers, shouting, "Hey, let's stretch the banner straighter." James stood there, breathing heavily, until he was sure he wouldn't lose his nerve. Then he slowly walked to his car, flashes of rage and disgust sparkling in his head. Tom didn't even try to deny the connection with Liz. On the contrary, he hinted that everything was quite serious. Damned insolent, he thought, feeling that every day he hated Tom more. But now all the necessary conversations have taken place. The husbands were warned, the culprit was summoned for tests. Those who cheated have already received their notices. The mechanism of exposure has been launched. All that remains is to wait for this chilling story to reach its climax. The night passed alarmingly for all of Hillsborough. Rumors, like a poisonous fog, spread through the city. Someone saw Robert leave the school whiter than a sheet and drive off in an unknown direction. Someone in the bank heard Henry almost faint, clutching his heart, and the neighbor saw a pale Susan leaving the clinic, clutching some papers to her chest. The next morning, as the sun struggled to break through the March clouds, there was a sense of tension in Hillsborough. James, arriving at the clinic at 8, noticed that Henry Walker was stomping around the entrance, the one whom he had confronted yesterday with the fact of his wife's betrayal. Henry, seeing James, coughed awkwardly and approached. "Doctor, excuse me for being here, but will you help me with the tests?" "Of course," James nodded. Now let's go in and do a blood draw. Henry just grinned wryly, wrinkling his forehead. I didn't sleep all night. Carol, she locked herself in the bathroom and cried. She didn't really say anything, but I realized that everything was true. I'm sorry, James muttered. They entered and James told the nurse to take the necessary samples from Henry. The next victim was already waiting in the corridor. Robert, his eyes were red. Apparently, he had not slept even longer. As soon as he saw James, he hissed, "Susan and I fought all night." She admitted that she slept with Tom. And can you imagine, she claims that she did this because I was too cold towards her. Don't they have enough excuses? James spread his hands. I'm sorry, Robert. I understand your anger. But now the main thing is your health. Get tested, then decide what to do with your wife. Robert looked gloomy, but nodded. Walking towards the treatment room, he exhaled. Okay, now there's no time for talking. In James's office, the atmosphere was no less electric. During a short correspondence with Marge, it turned out that some women were due to come in today to receive treatment appointments. Well, he thought, let's see how strong their nerves are. Margaret was the first to rush in. She took off her stupid hat and squeezed it in her hands, as if she wanted to squeeze out water. The face turned red, the eyes were swollen. Doctor, Henry said he will file for divorce. She squeezed out as soon as the door closed behind her. What should I do? Can you somehow? I don't know. Say that this is a mistake. James frowned. Error? Margaret, the tests aren't wrong. I understand that you are scared, but these are the consequences of your actions. She sat down on a chair and burst into tears. James was silent for a long time, letting her cry. Finally, she frantically wiped her nose with a handkerchief and whispered, My life is over. What will I tell my parents? What will people say? You should undergo treatment, James stated dryly. And about people, we should have thought about this earlier. Margaret nodded, took the prescription and walked out, barely able to stand. Susan came in next, pale and gloomy. She said that Robert was asking for a divorce. James listened carefully to her sobs that there was a moment of weakness, and it wouldn't happen again. But according to her analyses and confessions from the party, it seems that there was more than one moment of weakness. Susan, I'm not a judge, James said when she fell silent. I'm just a doctor who monitors health. But if Robert intends to break up with you, that's his decision. She just nodded, staggering, and left. A similar scene was repeated with other women whose names surfaced in the documents. Some cried, some cursed. Everyone was prescribed treatment, and everyone was reminded to inform their partners. But no one could hide the main theme. A huge scandal was breaking out in the town. By 11 in the morning, the doors of the clinic opened with a roar. Tom Wilson entered, wearing an expensive jacket with a defiant gait. He stood in the middle of the reception room and, looking around, grinned. Well, doctor, I'm here. Will you show me where your scary tests are? Nurse Marge, frowning, pointed to James's office. Tom walked inside and almost immediately began. Listen, Carter, let's avoid the circus. I don't have any infections, and these women keep lying. James closed the door so that others would not hear and said evenly, Fine. Then donate blood, a smear, and we'll see. Tom snorted. Yes, easily. Only then will you declare that I am clean. And in general, I have everything covered. We'll see about that, James answered dryly, looking into Tom's eyes. Now tell me, did you have contact with Liz? It was the first time he spoke the name Liz openly. His heart was pounding, but he had to know the truth. Tom's smile became even bolder. Let's say they were, he muttered. What do you want? Are the horns too tight? James felt all the blood rush to his face. He made an effort not to punch Tom right in the jaw. I am a doctor, he said, and in this case I am obliged to know her potential contacts. Listen, Tom shrugged, at least 10 times. Ask your wife why she has such a crush on me. I have had, and will have any woman I want. James almost broke the pen he was holding in his hand. but Nurse Marge, who looked into the office for cotton wool, prevented a possible fight. Tom chuckled condescendingly and extended his hand to draw blood. "Come on, just be careful." Marge carried out the procedure, trying to work quickly and without unnecessary words. When it was all over, Tom stood up, putting on his jacket. "How long do you have to wait for the result?" "A day or two," James replied. "Great," Tom snorted. "I can't wait to see how you apologize." With these words, he left, slamming the door so hard that the glass rattled. James remained in the office, wearily sinking into his chair. He was shaking not so much from fear as from rage and disgust. He understood that Tom Wilson had a certain reserve of impudence, and perhaps connections that allowed him to feel unpunished. But the facts are undeniable. The women indicated him. A few minutes later, Marge knocked on the door. "Doc, are you okay?" James nodded without looking up. "Yes, just a hard day. And apparently, it will only get worse. People are already whispering," Marge added. "They say that half the city will soon get divorced." She said this with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. James understood that for her, this was not just a job. It was also the first place where the latest gossip was born. But he asked, "Don't make a big deal, Marge. Let them sort it out themselves. I have enough problems as it is." "Okay, Doc," she shrugged and left, closing the door. Left alone, James thought that acting neutral would no longer work. Too much has become known about Liz and Tom. Now it's time for the toughest conversation alone with your wife. He needed to hear her confession, and if she continues to lie, he will confront her with the facts and tell her it's over. But before that, there was one more step left, an official record of the results of Tom and the others' tests. If Tom's infection is confirmed, it will be a final blow to everyone who contacted him. Tonight will be decisive, James decided, glancing at his watch. It was only midday, but he felt tired, as if he had spent 3 days in a row in the clinic. The house greeted James with silence. Liz was already inside, her car parked in the driveway and the lights on in the kitchen windows. He pushed the front door, closed it quietly behind him, and listened. There was a faint smell of cooked dinner in the air. It seemed like stewed vegetables. "Liz," he called, although his heart was beating unevenly. "In the kitchen," her voice responded. She stood at the stove in a t-shirt and jeans, stirring a saucepan with a spoon. Seeing James, she was embarrassed for a moment, but then smiled. "Hello. Hungry?" "Not really," he answered briefly, taking off his jacket. "We need to talk." Liz put the spoon down, put the lid on the pan, and turned to him. Her gaze was wary. "It's like you're not yourself. Did something happen?" James chuckled. "Did something happen? Yes, everything has already happened." But he said out loud more calmly than he felt, "I know about you and Tom. I saw you together at his country house." Liz's eyes widened, showing fear. She automatically took a step back, leaning against the tabletop. "What are you talking about?" She tried to brush it off. "Don't make things up. I just met at a party." "At a party?" he repeated with a bitter smile. "I saw you take him into the next room, Liz. I stood in the yard with binoculars, saw your dance, your hugs." She turned pale, her lips trembled. But having gathered herself, Liz tried to counterattack. Were you following me?" "Yes, I did," James snapped, "because I knew you were lying. And now I have proof. Stop pretending, Liz." She bit her lip. For a moment, there was dead silence in the kitchen. Only the refrigerator was humming somewhere behind the wall. Then Liz muttered nervously, "Okay, yes, I was at Tom's party, but it's not what you think. We were just dancing, fooling around a little." "Stop it," James exploded, slamming his palm onto the table. "I'm tired of your excuses. It wasn't just stupidity. This is cheating, and you know it. Did you have sex with Tom? Answer directly." Liz swallowed convulsively, and her eyes filled with tears. But she was in no hurry to answer. James already realized that her silence was a confession. I'm confused," she finally managed. "Tom, he is so bright, bold, and next to him I feel welcome. And you are always busy, always tired, silent at home. I, I'm not saying that's an excuse, but the words cut James like a blade, so she lacked emotions and attention. Liz, he said quietly, do you understand that you could infect me or others with your entertainment? Tom has confirmed cases of transmission of the infection. One after another, my patients come in with an infection, pointing to it. Oh my God. She breathed, covering her face with her hands. I didn't know. We urgently need to check you too, James said dryly. But now we are talking not only about the disease, it's about your betrayal. Liz began to cry, tears flowing down her cheeks, but there was still some amount of stubbornness in her. I'm sorry, she sobbed, but we're both to blame. You didn't notice me, I felt like an empty place. And Tom found the right words at the right moment, and everything started to spin. I, I thought I could stop. Stop? He asked, feeling his chest become empty. Okay. How long does it take you? Month? 2? Liz looked away. More. A couple of months already, but not often. Maybe 3 or 4 times. She didn't finish. She was overcome by sobs. James felt an icy hand squeezing his soul. Fury flared up in my soul. He grabbed a cup from the table and threw it forcefully into the sink. It shattered into pieces. Liz shuddered and burst into tears even louder. I don't know what to do, she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. I understand that you won't forgive me. But you're right, I won't forgive you, he answered dully. Sorry, but I can't live with such betrayal. She took a step towards him, extended her hand as if she wanted to hug him, but James pulled back, clenching his fists. Don't you dare touch me, he shouted, his voice breaking with emotional intensity. I trusted you for so many years, and you. He couldn't finish the sentence, his throat was tight. Liz fell to her knees, still sobbing. He looked down at her as if she were a stranger. Just yesterday, she seemed like family to him, despite his suspicions, but now he felt almost disgusted with her. Suddenly, her phone, which was lying on the table, rang. The melody sounded deafening in the silence. Liz jumped up, looked at the screen, but did not answer the phone. Apparently, Tom or someone from his company decided to check what was wrong with her. Take it, James said bitterly. This is probably your bright and bold one. She just shook her head and turned off the call. James, she whispered, give me a chance to explain. I was unhappy. I felt that we were losing each other. Don't you understand? He almost growled. This is the end. I don't need excuses. He turned around and walked out into the hallway, leaving Liz sitting on the floor, her shoulders shaking from crying. For a moment he wanted to go back, hug her, say, we'll fix everything. But the wounds were too deep. He took his coat and keys and quickly walked out the door, leaving the house plunged into heavy silence. Night found him in a pickup truck parked on the side of the road at the exit of the city. James could not go to his friends or rent a room at the same Green Pine motel. He was too exhausted. Finally, he reclined the seat and, falling asleep, heard himself whisper, our marriage is dead. A couple of weeks flew by in a merciless whirlpool of events. Almost every day, the clinic received subpoenas or requests from lawyers. Robert, Henry, and 2 other husbands filed for divorce, demanding that their wives admit their guilt and sue for their property. The city was mired in gossip. Everyone was aware. Carter is in trouble. Robert is in trouble. Henry is in trouble. James tried to keep his face as he continued to work, although every patient appointment turned into a sympathy session or questioning. Mrs. Henderson, the cinnamon roll lover, brought him a pie one day and said with an apologetic smile, Doctor, we all love you. You are a good person. Don't be sad. But her sympathy only made James feel more bitter. In the evening, when he was returning to his rented accommodation, he received a call from the lawyer whom he hired to file a divorce from Liz. He said that Liz consented to divorce according to a simplified procedure without division of property because the house formerly belonged to James. He bought it before the wedding. So, at least without a scandal, he thought with relief. But this did not lessen the pain. The end of 15 years of marriage came officially, without options or delays. The next day, he and Liz met at the lawyer's to sign the papers. The room smelled of leather and papers. Liz arrived pale, in a modest shirt, without makeup. She barely glanced at James, took the pen and signed it. He did the same thing, like an actor in a play where the lines have long been known. "Congratulations, your divorce takes effect within a month," the lawyer announced dryly, collecting the papers. Congratulations sounded mocking. James involuntarily grimaced. Liz looked up at him, as if she wanted to say something, but didn't dare. He was also silent, and when they left the office, a cold gust of wind ruffled her hair. "Well, that's all," she said quietly. "Yes, that's it," he answered, turning away. "James, I'll probably go to my sister in a neighboring town," she muttered. "Everyone here looks at me too askance, and I can't live in the house where we were together." He didn't argue. Words like "good luck" or "take care" didn't come out of my mouth. It seemed to him that he had already said everything he could. He simply nodded, put his hands in his pockets, and walked away along the sidewalk, where people turned to look at him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Thus, formally, they were still husband and wife for a month until the date when the court signed the final decision. But in fact, their marriage died. Rumors spread around the city that Liz Carter has left, that Tom Wilson is also thinking about changing his place of residence due to threats, and that Dr. Carter is going to close the clinic. On the eve of the trial, James received another blow. Tom's test results arrived at the clinic. He really did have an infection, and more than one. It turns out that all the rumors about that same source were officially confirmed. Tom was registered, but somehow he dodged a big scandal by paying a fine and promising to undergo mandatory treatment. James looked at this farce and became convinced that there was no point in staying in Hillsborough. Everything here is rotten, and no good memories hold him back anymore. The next day, he walked into a local real estate office and posted an advertisement for the sale of the Carter Clinic. Officially, the building was called Hillsborough Medical Center, but everyone called him by the doctor's name. The girl taking the order even asked in surprise, "Doctor, are you sure? This is the only full-fledged clinic in our town." "I'm sure," he answered hoarsely. "I'm leaving practice here." Saying goodbye, she shook his hand with the words, "We will miss you, doctor." But he only smiled sadly, knowing that behind his back there would still be whispers about scandal and shame. Taking personal belongings, old textbooks, and photographs from his office, he went outside and looked back at the Carter Clinic sign for the last time. For 15 years, he treated local residents, listening to their complaints and secrets. And then at one moment, everything was destroyed. He threw into the street trash can an old sign with the inscription, "Best Dr. Hillsborough," which Mrs. Henderson had once given. "Goodbye, Hillsborough," he whispered, getting into the pickup truck. "I did everything I could for you, but you've taken too much from me." The path to a new future was unclear, but he was firmly sure of one thing. There was no place for him here anymore. Several months passed, and no one in Hillsborough saw Dr. Carter again. The new owners renamed the Carter Clinic Health Medical Center, brought in new equipment, and hired 2 young doctors from a neighboring county. The city was slowly recovering from the scandal, although a residue remained. Liz actually went to her sister's and lived there for some time. She communicated with one of her former neighbors via Messenger, admitting that she regrets what happened. Where Tom Wilson is now also remains a mystery. They said he sold the house, took the money, and moved closer to major cities to get lost among millions of people. Many families were destroyed, but some of the deceived husbands tried to start a new relationship. Someone quit their previous job and moved away. The Devil's Spring in Hillsborough changed the lives of dozens of people. Meanwhile, James Carter settled in another state, in a large city hospital. The first months were difficult. Night shifts, flows of patients with serious injuries, the bustle of the metropolis. But little by little he got into the rhythm. The big city didn't ask about his past. He didn't care who came here and why, as long as he worked well. Sometimes, when James returned to his small rented apartment in his spare time, he thought about Hillsborough, about how he lived there for 15 years, how he married Liz, how he saved patients and listened to their secrets. Sometimes in his dreams he dreamed of Mrs. Henderson's buns and the cobblestones of the main street, bathed in sun. But when he woke up, he realized that this was a thing of the past. The pain from the betrayal still echoed inside like a phantom wound. However, work helped. Every day he saved lives, helped patients, without thinking that one of them would lie or betray. He was just doing his job. At some point, he caught himself thinking that he felt satisfaction. I am living again and not painfully existing. One day, when he was sitting in the resident's room late at night, wearily looking through the medical history of another patient, he received a message on his phone from an unknown number. "I hope you are okay. Sorry for everything. Liz." His heart sank, but he immediately deleted the message without answering. He had nothing more to say to her. In the window of the staff room, the light of the big city, the lights of street lamps and endless cars flickered. James stood up and stretched, thinking that tomorrow there would be an early rise again, and there would be many sick people. He sighed and went out into the corridor of the hospital, where the lights were always on and life went on, not sleeping for a minute. New life, he thought, heading towards the patients, without lies and betrayals. A young intern called out to him in the corridor. "Dr. Carter, there was a difficult case, and I need your advice." James turned around and nodded briefly. "They are going." And at that moment, he felt a strange, almost forgotten feeling of confidence. Whatever his past, his present is helping people. What about the future? It is open like a blank slate. And he, James Carter, is finally ready to turn the page. End. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.